remember asking this question to a head of a classical Christian school and saying, "Hey, what does success look like for you?" And his answers were, "Are the students getting married and staying married?
Wow.
Are they going to church on Sunday?" And
Mhm.
he listed 4 or 5. Are they participating in local, civic life and politics, and are they voting? I think it's a similar metrics for homeschool families,
Mhm.
raising kids that participate in. I mean, I think one of the things that you see across the board from America's founders is this sense that, like, self-government is this really rare, exceptional thing
Mhm.
that doesn't happen often.
Welcome to the Homeschool Connections podcast. I'm your host, Kaitlin Zara, and I'm so glad you're spending some time with me today. New episodes drop every week, so make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you're watching on YouTube. All right, mamas, grab your coffee, press play, and let's homeschool together. Today, we've got Jeremy Tate, the founder and CEO of the CLT, filling us in on everything we've ever wanted to know about classical education and this awesome SAT ACT alternative. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Caitlin, thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. Can you tell our listeners, first and foremost, why is classical education especially important in today's world? I know.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a great question. Yeah, I think first and foremost, it has to do with the telos. I spent 10 years in the public school arena and 3 years in inner city New York teaching. And by the end of my time, I was just becoming disillusioned with kind of the whole project of public education. And I would often ask my students, what are we doing here? What's the point of school? And they would say, to get something like to get a better job almost every time, without kind of thinking about it. And almost like, we know this, Mr. Tate, to get a better job. C.S. Lewis says that when education is beaten by jobs training, civilization dies, right? And so fundamentally, this multi-billion-dollar education project in America is incapable of kind of even defining what education is. And the main view was a very impoverished view, right? The ancient telos of education was always the cultivation of virtue, right? The cultivation of love, of kindness, of generosity, becoming a certain kind of person. It's interesting to me that education was often just called formation, for especially many in the Catholic education tradition as well. And so I think for parents, really kind of reclaiming, their role as the first and primary educators of their own children, I think is really, really crucial. And we're seeing the fruits of that. I mean, I'm amazed, some of these young people I'm meeting that were homeschooled growing up. It gives me so much hope, for the future of our country.
Unbelievable. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So, we talk a little bit about how classical education is solving this issue that modern education is not, right? You said that a lot of your students were just thinking that education was the means to an end, kind of to get a better job. But what do you
Yeah.
think classical education prepares students for? How does it prepare them for life and make them critical thinkers?
So there's kind of an interesting irony here, right? I think of the people that I'm employing. We've got about 65 full time at CLT. I overwhelmingly hire from places like Patrick Henry College, Hillsdale, Thomas Aquinas College, Benedictine, the University of Dallas, and many of them were homeschooled growing up. And it's interesting that, like, they had this education that was aimed at heaven, aimed at the cultivation of virtue, but like then they become amazingly employable. Like, the aim was so much greater that they get this lesser thing thrown in. And I think especially right now where a lot of people are working remote, I mean, any serious company, what do you need? I mean, you need ethically grounded, like,
Mhm.
employees who are gonna do well by their employer, who are gonna be passionate about mission. I think one of the most, um, salient marks right now of kind of the public school dilemma is, like, it's kind of a generation of a lot of students who are kind of indifferent about everything. They kind of just don't care about most things. And that was my experience, at least. And I
Mhm.
think you meet a lot of these homeschoolers that are really, really passionate, about changing the world. So I think word has gotten out. I think colleges and universities, top schools, that know that homeschool students, because what's happening is a lot of the homeschoolers end up shining in and seminars and debates, in the classroom, then the professors go back and they say, "Can we get more of these students?" So it was like 25 years ago, they didn't really know what to do with homeschoolers. And now, I mean, they're really kind of the most heavily recruited demographic by a lot of colleges. I mean, and again, I want to be careful to not bash public school students. I've met many amazing public school families, but I mean, many of these homeschoolers, they're just like qualitatively different.
Mhm.
And employers get it as well. In fact, I just hired my first who didn't go to college at all. He killed the CLT, he crushed it, and he had really thoughtful reasons of not wanting to go to college at the moment, and he was homeschooled. He's been incredible. He's like 18, 19 years old. He's been fantastic. So I think they're leagues ahead, and this isn't new. I think about some of the luminaries in American history. They
Mhm.
take someone like John Quincy Adams, homeschooled, by Abigail Adams, of course, great teacher. But by 13, 14, he'd mastered 4 or 5 European languages. He had an incredible command of world history, and he was serving as a private ambassador to private ambassador to the something in St. Petersburg, Russia, as a 14-year-old. Really, really incredible, and I think so. There's this legacy that we're recovering, which is fun.
I continue to hear exactly what you're saying. This message of homeschoolers are recruited, they are wanted by colleges. The tides are turning from that time, like you said. We had a
Yeah,
long time ago there were everybody was homeschooled. That was normal for everyone. Then we kind of shifted as a society that homeschooling might have been alternative education. And now, like you're saying, colleges are really interested in homeschooled students. And like you just said, hiring someone that was not a college student, but homeschoolers were built different. There's a lot of ambitious, curious, very moral, like you said,
yeah,
homeschoolers that are highly employable, which I think is so exciting. So, Jeremy, going back to this classical education that builds the foundation for that amazing future for our kids, what does success in a classical homeschool environment look like? And especially when compared to both of us, I know you spoke to being in a public school. I was a public school teacher for a decade. What does it look
yeah.
compared to the test driven results of a mainstream education?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think actually of a conversation I had years ago with, and Kayla, I didn't really know about this world until after. I only knew a little bit, until after starting CLT. And then it was kind of like peeling back the layers of an onion and discovering this massive, amazing, beautiful homeschooling movement, but also just the classical school movement as a whole, which I think also includes a lot of great communities and brick and mortar schools. And I remember asking this question to a head of a classical Christian school and saying, "Hey, what does success look like for you?" And his answers were, "Are the students getting married and staying married?
Wow.
Are they going to church on Sunday?"
Hmm.
And he listed 4 or 5. Are they participating in local, civic life and politics, and are they voting? It was really cool. It was not test scores. It was not what percent are we getting into the Ivies. I think it's a similar metrics for homeschool families. Raising kids that participate in. I mean, I think one of the things that you see across the board from America's founders is this sense that like self-government is this really rare, exceptional thing
Hmm.
that doesn't happen often. And you need an unusually educated and an unusually virtuous, populace to maintain self-government. And that's exactly what's coming out of the homeschool arena. But I do think, everybody likes to have some things that are measurable. A lot of things are not measurable. I mean, the capacity of, to love and the affections of the heart, these are not really measurable at the end of the day. But if you're going to church on Sunday, it's measurable. If you're staying married, it's measurable. So I think these are some of the key metrics.
Amazing. Absolutely. I think most, if not all, homeschoolers would certainly agree with everything that you're saying. We want that beautiful life for all of our children. So, Jeremy, as we're seeing education change dramatically and quickly, I really want to hear your thoughts on AI and classical education. Emily Brown from Fiat Life Coaching offers premium support for Catholic homeschooling moms to learn essential skills to manage their time, other people's behavior, and their own mental and emotional well being. Get all the details for her signature program, the Happy Holy Mama membership, at fiatlifecoaching.com.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm here in Annapolis, Maryland, and I'm just a couple blocks from St. John's College. St. John's is an interesting place. I mean, there's no majors at St. John's College. Kind of a deep dive. It's kind of a non-Catholic version of Thomas Aquinas College. So TAC and St. John's are pretty similar. And these are the schools that are least impacted by AI. Well, why is that? Well, if you go into this school and you tour one of the rooms, it's a seminar. They've got a big round table. There's no technology allowed in the room. They've got a chalkboard and books, and so how are they impacted or threatened by AI? Like not at all, actually, right? But from pretty much every other college, yeah, I mean, the essays are actually really good and they're getting better, that AI can produce and to generate. And so what's been lost in this is that, you know, um, the formative process, you're a different kind of person, after you've had to work through, a big serious thesis paper or something like that. And now you've got a whole generation of students, they're getting the artifact, they're getting the thing, they're getting the paper, but they haven't been formed and pressed through the process itself. I'm actually really optimistic in some ways, Caitlin, that um, the AI revolution is actually going to kind of force education kind of back to what I would call first principles, and so how are you going to have serious education in an AI world? Well, you end up doing this thing. I think of the best time I ever had teaching in public schools, and I was kind of 1 foot out already, and I was kind of just again disillusioned, giving up on the whole project. But I was teaching evening high school to make some extra money. 4 kids at the time, 6 kids now,
Amazing.
and these kids had already failed out of day school. They were coming to evening school to get their credit, and honestly, they were showing up high in this kind of thing,
Mhm.
and I said, "Look," I looked at their textbook, and it was a smorgasbord. It was just, you know, no real good stories, and it was just excerpts from a lot of things. I said, "We're not gonna look at the textbooks all year." I said, "We're not even gonna have any tests, and you're not gonna have any essays. So we're gonna sit in a circle, and we're gonna read out loud together.
Mm,
And if you're dialed in and paying," and I bought him copies of Flannery O'Connor short stories, and it was the best semester I ever had teaching in my life, you know? All they had to do was be engaged, if I mean, and so I do think AI is gonna push educators back to thinking, what even is education? Like, what is the point of it in the first place? But I think there are some reasons to be, hopeful about the future, but I mean, it's there's some real doomsday situations out there, and, I think I'm very grateful that we've got this rising generation of grounded, ethically formed, homeschoolers, that I think are gonna help us navigate a lot of the moral, questions that AI is gonna be raising.
I couldn't agree more. Jeremy, your story resonates so much with my story and what
Yeah,
I'm thinking as you're speaking, because my best experiences teaching public school were when I closed that door and taught something that I made up all on my own. Something
yeah,
that was not from a book that was given to me by the district, that was not given to me by, the state or the federal government, as, so much of what we have to teach is, and how both of us had these experiences where when we really just got down to it and circled our students around us, read out loud, discussed it, it was authentic and it was real. And I'm sure that your students remember that as being a very special, milestone in their own education. I just keep thinking that that is really what I get to do every day as a homeschool mom. I get to
totally.
make
Yeah.
what is going to be the most valuable for my sons, and what a gift that is.
I love that, it's so beautiful. I remember this one student, if you're are you a fan of Flannery O'Connor?
I have not heard of him. Is that crazy?
Flannery O'Connor, I think one of the best Catholic authors of the 20th century, and
Oh,
her life was cut short. She died in her early 40s
oh.
of lupus. But what she was doing was shocking people with kind of the human capacity for evil. But in the point of in the by shocking people, she was waking them up to kind of spiritual realities. And there's this one story called Good Country People where this kind of con artist figure, he actually steals this girl's prosthetic leg. And I remember one of my students, his mind was so blown by how demented and evil this was. He got out of his seat and was just walking around the classroom like, I've never heard of something so dark, and twisted, but it was kind of waking him up to the
Mhm.
spiritual realm. And that's where, I think public education has gone so wrong. And I think there's such an opportunity with homeschooling.
Absolutely. Well, you've given me some new reading to do. I read every morning before my boys wake up, so I'm excited to dig into that. It sounds incredible. So, Jeremy, let's talk a little bit about the CLT. Let's dig into that for a minute. I want to know, why do you think it resonates so deeply with parents who have chosen homeschooling and classical education for their kids?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say at the start, on the surface level, like in some ways I always say in some ways CLT does like the least exciting, sexy thing in the classical renewal movement. It's a standardized test. And early on, people were like, a standardized test is like where everything went wrong with education. And so what I like to do, and some people just say, like even my own kids sometimes, my brother-in-law is a football coach and
Mhm.
he's cool. I run a standardized testing company. It's like, standardized test, could anything be? Sometimes we'll joke that the only thing more boring than taking a standardized test is hearing somebody talk about a standardized test. But it's really interesting, and I think it's precisely because it's boring to most people
Mhm.
that standardized testing, kind of like flies under the radar, is actually like the most powerful lever in American education.
Mhm.
And so if you imagine this as a hypothetical for a minute, or imagine that the SAT has been around since 1926. Imagine that the SAT and the ACT had always been tests where students know that's where you're going to have to read Aristotle. That's where you're going to have to see Thomas Aquinas. That's where you're going to see Shakespeare. If people always knew that, it would reshape what happens in every school in the country, right?
Yeah.
And it would, in some ways, redefine what it meant to be educated coming out of high school. I mean, in fact, if the SAT and ACT had always been like that, I don't just think American education would be different. I think American culture as a whole would be profoundly different, right?
Mhm.
But instead, the tests have gone in the exact opposite direction. And in many ways, they have censored the entire Catholic, Christian, Western intellectual tradition,
Mhm.
and it conveys to students I mean, students process the SAT, ACT as an external authority. It's bigger than their school. It's bigger than their homeschooling parents, and it conveys in a really powerful way what is important. And so one of the ways we look at this, I mean, if you go to an ed school and you major in secondary education, they basically teach you to think about testing as an evaluative tool. And
Mhm.
that's true. It is an evaluative tool, but it's equally true that it's a pedagogical tool, right? Tests actually teach as well, and very similar to the place
Mm.
of the law in like moral, theology. The law is also teacher. And that's what we want to, what does it mean to be educated? We think part of what it means to be educated is that you're able to read and understand the most important texts that have driven and shaped, society and culture for the past 2,000 years. So you think about this now, I mean, a lot of public school students, they've never even heard the word philosophy or
Right.
theology. I mean, how crazy. Theology was
Mhm.
the queen of the sciences. Christians built the first universities. We, in many ways, built the entire education system.
Mhm.
And I mean, and you think about for a second, what was education like for America's founding generation? None of whom were Catholic, except for a couple, actually. Um, but it was penmanship. It was a lot of Greek. It was a lot of Latin. It was a lot of translation. They were reading heavily from, the classics. They were reading heavily from the great tradition of Athens. Aristotle and Plato, and what is education, today? It looks nothing like that, right? So I think the reason CLT has resonated, I think, with a lot of homeschoolers, is because, we are trying to redefine what it means to be educated coming out of high school. And homeschool parents are already doing that, and so for them, the CLT is just it's a better tool, right, to showcase the academic ability. And a lot of great colleges now, a place like Christendom or University of Dallas or Benedictine or Hillsdale, they don't just accept the CLT, they actually prefer the CLT because they know it's a much more serious reflection of a student's academic ability coming out of high school.
So tell me more about that. I know that for some homeschool parents, they're worried that like the SAT or the ACT is not going to align with whatever they've been teaching for the last however many years. So how is this CLT actually different? When we get the test in front of us, so many of us remember, Jeremy, taking the SAT. I still remember taking it. How does your test actually look and feel different?
Yeah, probably three key areas I'd focus in on. And so the first, again, is what we would call source material. So source material is like what's actually on the test. And so what we want to put on the test is we want to put in the most important authors and thinkers that have driven the development of society and culture for the past 2,000 years. So students are going to see Dante, they're going to see Aristotle, they're going to see Catherine of Siena, they're going to see Shakespeare. These kind of authors that are basically never on the SAT or ACT. It's very rare for the SAT and ACT to have anything. That's starting to change a little bit,
Yeah.
and I could talk about that as well. And we've been told that's because of the influence of CLT, but it's very rare for them to have anything on before really the beginning of the 20th century. It's all very modern. The other thing is this: SAT and ACT both have what are called sensitivity committees, and so the sensitivity committee, I actually think the origins of this started off in a good way. So this
Mhm.
is like the 1990s, early 90s, and the idea was like, look, if you have a reading passage, let's say that references something like suicide, and the student had
Mhm.
an uncle commit suicide, they're going to be rattled to the point that you're not even going to get an accurate score because this is triggering this memory. I think there's something really good in that impulse, right? But the sensitivity concept and the sensitivity committees went totally nuts over the past 15 years. I've met with people from the College Board SAT sensitivity committee, and the idea is that like basically anything can trigger anyone for any reason, and so you end up with like the most sterile, mundane, boring passages. This is how you end up with passages about penguins because, penguins can't trigger people, I guess, or you end up with passages about the processing of Greek yogurt,
Mhm.
because these are not triggering for people. We take a kind of an opposite approach and we say, look, we're going to avoid the contemporary hot button issues.
Yeah.
It's very rare for anything to be on the CLT before about 1950, and
Mhm.
most passages are centuries and centuries old. But we don't shy away from controversy at all. Your students have seen Karl Marx, they've seen Charles Darwin on the CLT, they've seen C.S. Lewis, they've seen, I mean, really any of the great thinkers from the Christian tradition as well. It's very rare. We did an audit of the SAT years ago, and we got a hold of about 13 full-length SATs. There were a total of 0 passages from any Christian Catholic thinker. 0, fully censoring, kind of this tradition. Source material is a big part. Another is what are we doing in the test itself? And so there's this long debate in standardized testing over what we call aptitude
Mhm.
and achievement. And so the old SAT was what's called an aptitude test. And so if you think of a pure aptitude concept, that would be something like a puzzle. It's like you've never seen the puzzle before, and now you've got to put it together. And it's really testing like cognitive ability, right? How much kind of cognitive horsepower.
Sure.
The ACT launched in 1959 with kind of a critique of the whole aptitude concept. And they said aptitude testing isn't fair. Students should be tested on what they're taught in the classroom. And initially that sounds great. Yeah, of course. But then if you stop and you're like, wait a minute, which classroom are we talking about? Is this a Jewish day school, a homeschool, a Catholic school, a public school, a classical Christian school? What is it? And it became very clear over time that it was a public school. And in 2015, both the SAT and ACT aligned with the Common Core standards. And so CLT and the SAT completely, when they started to lose to the ACT around 2010, they changed to an achievement test and they got rid of the aptitude concept. CLT has brought back some of the markers, the hallmarks of aptitude testing. So this would be something like analogies. There's no analogies on the SAT, not any anymore. It used to be full of analogies. If you took it, I took it in 1999. Back then, it was full of analogies. And this is a really critical way to measure a student's ability to connect ideas, right? And that's kind of like what we mean by thinking, the ability to connect ideas, right? So analogies are really important. So we've brought these back. You also see this on the math side. with the questions that like this doesn't fall into algebra 1 or algebra 2 or trig or geometry. These are logic puzzles, so this is also testing ability as well. And when we talk about aptitude, it's not just like are you born with cognitive horsepower? We're also talking about have you been given a formation that has taught you to think well and deeply.
Mm.
And homeschoolers really, really shine on these kinds of things.
Incredible. It sounds like you have a test here, the CLT, but you have a countercultural movement going on as well that I think a lot of homeschool parents are really just going to get behind. Everything you're saying totally resonates with what I want. Like I've said before, for my children and for their education, and I think this sounds amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's an exciting time in the country. I mean, I think that we're in the beginning in some ways of a real spiritual revival. I
Yep.
think parents have kind of finally, really started to wake up in big numbers to kind of the miseducation that's been happening in American in public schools. The numbers of homeschoolers, continue to rise, and more we're seeing these people get into the workforce and get into colleges and universities. And again, it's shocking for a lot of people. I mean, I don't think a lot of people knew that 17 and 18-year-olds could be as eloquent, as mature, as so many of these homeschoolers are.
Absolutely. So, Jeremy, I know, and I'm going to try to say this in a politically correct way, but as the CLT gains traction with colleges and gets more popular and more widely accepted, how do you maintain its alignment with classical ideas when the world would probably want to standardize it and turn it more culturally appropriate to what everybody else is doing?
Yeah, the CLT itself, in terms of the test, is pretty locked. So we've got an author bank where we've got about around 200 authors that are on that. We've talked about some of these before, but again, we're talking about Boethius, Dante, Shakespeare, and we've got an academic board. We've got about 75 folks on our academic board as well, and kind of their job is to keep CLT grounded. We've got this big goal, Kaitlin, of 2040. We've actually, if you come over to the CLT office, if you're ever near Annapolis, come by and say hello, and I can show you this. But we've got we've had this engraved on a big bronze plaque. And you start reading it, and at first it looks just like a boring history of a standardized test. Who cares about that? Then you look closer, and it says in 2040, the CLT surpassed the SAT and ACT as the #1 college entrance exam globally. So we're very ambitious to do that. And again, because we feel like if you can create a new gold standard, and that term actually was a term that Pete Hegseth used as the Secretary of Defense, or I guess the Secretary of War now. He said the CLT is a new gold standard, but really, it's new because it's old. It's reflective of, again, the kind of education that was totally normal until about 100 years ago when we started to go in this kind of hard secular progressive direction. So we're bringing back the tried and true, and I think with that, it's actually been extremely disruptive. Just people have been really, really shocked that like this industry can be disrupted in a big way as well. And I feel like there's a lot of momentum, to get to the 2040 goal. We just had the service academies come on, and the conversations we're having with folks at the Pentagon and others is, right now they're accepting it, but I do think in a few years it'll be very clear that it's the preferred test as well for people applying to West Point and the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy. So it's an incredible time, and it makes me so hopeful about the future. I mean, again, I think our founders from Jefferson to Adams and to others, we're all very unanimous that the future of America was going to depend on the education of the electorate and the virtue of the electorate. And we're bringing this back through this homeschool movement, and I'm just grateful, CLT gets to be a part of it. In some ways, I see the work that we're doing is kind of providing what I'd call critical infrastructure, of you need kind of the roads and the bridges, and there's a limit to how much the homeschool movement or the classical ed movement can essentially scale as long as we're deferring to the secular progressive education establishment to define academic excellence, right? Which is what we're doing when we're looking at the PSAT and the SAT for what actually measures success.
Incredible. I've got a smile plastered on my face because you're giving me hope for this next generation too. I've got young kids. I know you said you've got 6 yourself, but it can be daunting. This world sometimes can
Yeah.
feel like things are stacked against us and it's hard to parent in 2025 and to raise
Well,
kid.
It's a labor of love. I mean, the easier thing to do is put your kid on the bus, and
Yes.
then as a mom, and that's not easy. You've got 7 or 8 hours to kinda get organized and to think, and the harder option is to do the hard there's no shortcuts into forming a child. I think of Mabel Tolkien, the mother of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Mhm.
She homeschooled. She didn't have to, and then she did it at a time that was very hard because they lost their dad when J.R.R. Tolkien was very young. But everything that made the Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings, his love for penmanship, his love for languages, calligraphy. I mean, Tolkien mastered 20 languages. He loved trees and nature. So much of what we see in the Lord of the Rings was all given to him. All of these affections were cultivated by his mom
Mhm.
homeschooling as a young child, and it changed the world. I mean, this is the most influential story and author probably of the whole 20th century. So the work that especially homeschool moms are doing is crucial. I think the future of in some ways like civilization kind of depends on it.
Mhm.
So I'm grateful for you, the work that y'all are doing. So
Thank you so much. I am so thankful for you. You are an influential, important voice in our community. And I think what you are doing, your work is so important and so cool.
thank you.
Jeremy, what would you like to leave our listeners with? Do you have any last words of wisdom or advice for us?
Well, I would say this. I know, we've got 6 kids and we've homeschooled. We've kind of done everything actually.
Yep.
Um, We actually homeschooled up until COVID, and then we we kinda took a break, but it can and does and kinda should in some ways feel like suffering, right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
that there's part of that is again, it's the hard work of forming a human in the right ways, which is really, really hard to do, but the fruit is beautiful, and so I have a immense gratitude for the parents that are choosing the harder option. So I'd say, just to stick with it. I mean, you're forming young people to love the right things, and it's gonna change the world.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. This has been so much fun. Everybody, I'm going to link in the show notes to where you can find Jeremy. Jeremy, I've got to note, you've got a very impressive X following you've got an amazing Twitter following. And so I know you mentioned
Oh,
earlier
thank you.
in the conversation that maybe, standardized testing is the least cool thing you could do as for your kids. But I think
Yeah.
you've definitely got some cool points for that X following. I'm going to link to that in any of your social media websites below. You can check out more of the CLT and some classical education. So check out those links in the show notes, everybody. Jeremy, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much
Hey,
for
thanks, Caitlin.
today.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
This isn't the end of the conversation. I want to hear from you. Come say hi on Instagram, connect with me on Facebook, or leave a comment below. I want to know what today's conversation sparked in you. I read and respond to every message. Until next time, remember, you got this.